First, just for me personally, guys, thank you. You guys were awesome this year. You know, for me coming in, the main thing for me was trying to build a culture with you guys in a short amount of time. I just wanted to treat you guys how I wanted to be treated as a player when I played. I truly, genuinely, seriously, guys, care about each and every one of you. On the field, off the field, tomorrow, next week, and next month, next year, 5 years, a decade from now. My number's not going to change. For those of you that get an opportunity at the next level, all I can say is, man, recircuit your mind. Don't forget that chip on your shoulder and what it took you to get to this point. All right, go back in time and remember when nobody freaking gave you a chance. You know, you may have been a stud in high school and college, and then you're in that space. Don't forget how you got to those points where you were the best. All right, sometimes we take that for granted. You can't go through the motions to be great. And if you're back, let's go. Let's go, man. Let's ride. It's a lot of good things going for you guys, man. I know the journey sucks. It's hard sometimes. You hit a lot of pitfalls. A lot of you guys are deserving. A lot of you guys are deserving. We are a playoff team, guys. We are a championship team. You know, we just fell short. You guys did a hell of a job. It breaks my heart that you guys have to go home tomorrow. It really does. But 7-3, playing in front of a great fan base. You guys had it made on that sense, man. That was fun. Fans are awesome. City of St. Louis embraced us. And that's exciting environment to play in, man. And last, man, I'll just leave you with this. Just attack your goals like your life depends on it, man. Attack your goals like your life depends on it. It's really it for me, guys. You know, I'm disappointed. We are a playoff team. But let's be real, okay? 2 weeks ago, we had our opportunity to grasp this thing. I mean, it is what it is. Love you guys, man. Seriously. You guys are family.
Welcome to the XFL Insider Podcast. Today you have your host Matthew, Drew, and Jake in the house. We're going to discuss the XFL Divisional Championship games as well as the Week 10 games of the regular season. How you two feeling today? You got any comments before we get rolling?
Playoffs, games that matter, finally, again.
Or depending on how you view it, games that don't matter.
Oh my gosh.
Here we have two great opinions. Again. Yes, I love it. We got the pro XFL playoff approach, and then we have the anti XFL playoff approach. I look forward to hearing you guys both speak civilly about the matter. All right. As we go, I just want to talk about divisional championship games are this weekend, Saturday and Sunday. We'll talk more about when and where here in just a bit. Don't forget about the XFL championship game on May 13th. That's at 8 p.m. Eastern, and it's in the Alamo Dome in San Antonio. That game will take place on ABC and ESPN both. As we go forward, not a lot of news. I just wanted to bring up the TV numbers, see if the guys had anything they wanted to bring up about them as well. It's basically staying the same from what we saw most of the season, in my opinion. We do have a little bit of a decline with the Seattle-Vegas game, but otherwise it looks pretty good across the board, and we're beating the USFL. Now, this isn't a competition to me. These are just things that people are arranging for success of the sport. So, guys, what do you think?
I think when you're talking about viewership between the XFL and the USFL right now, I wouldn't say necessarily that XFL is beating USFL. The total viewership is right around the same. USFL had both the most and least watched game this weekend. So I think the positive spin on this is just that spring football is getting the attention that it needs. Everybody wants it to succeed. You know, a lot of people act like they don't, but now a lot of people are coming around to it. So, you know, not a huge deal. The Vegas and Seattle game was not the least watched game of the year. So it's not like a massive disappointment or anything like that. It's just the ebbs and flows of the season. I think most people who really read the XFL's little tiebreaker sheet and then looked at the standings really knew that Seattle didn't have to score 34 points or anything like that. The differential really came into play there. So, there was a lot of confusion. I think the XFL and ESPN both could have done better to clear that up. And that honestly, the confusion probably led to some of the fall off, if you want to even call it that, in terms of viewership, in my opinion. But that's just me.
Okay, well, as we move forward, we'll see what happens with it. I'm sure some of it may drop off a little just because of some pissed off fans, but we'll see. Guys in the news department, do you have anything else you want to bring up? I know we're talking. This is probably the third to last episode of the podcast in terms of weekly sessions, so just want to throw that out there.
It's been a pretty quiet week, really, or quiet weekend, rather, in terms of news. I mean, last week you had the big news that Chris Smith had passed, and it was cool to see ESPN, give him his moment during the Seattle and Vegas game, just to, identify what happened and put it out there as a pretty warming moment in the post-game interview with Stormy Buonantony and Coach Haslett talking about him. So, but, it seems like news kind of died down a little bit and everything leveled out heading into the playoff weekend, Suns, whatever playoff controversy you want to call it.
With that note, I guess we'll move forward to the game summaries for the week. Now, for the last portion of the show, Jake Tribbey with Fantasy Points will be joining us to discuss the game matchups within the Divisional Championship, as well as the betting lines and some XFL fantasy aspects. We don't normally cover fantasy on here, but, we love it, and we'd love to talk about it, as well as the betting aspects. I know this week's is going to be a little bit different because we know a little bit more what we're looking at in terms of team-wise. So, as we move forward, let's go ahead and roll into the game summaries. Our first game, and Jake's favorite here, the Orlando Guardians lost 28-53 to the St. Louis Battlehawks. That game was in the Battle Dome in St. Louis. The Battlehawks put up a hell of a game, but it still wasn't enough to make it into the playoffs. Jake, you got any commentary you want to add?
The fact that the Battlehawks, obviously wanted to at least go out with the go big, go home mentality. I shouldn't be pissed off the way things ended up, considering it was only the whole tiebreaker thing was determined by 5 points. Whoop-de-doo. But, And I've realized that it's not just me that's been criticizing the way that the playoff qualification thing worked out. Obviously, even the media was confused about how the tiebreaker system was, because ESPN only detailed one tiebreaker. They didn't go through all 5. They went through one. That was only determined by one. They confused their audience on that. And then now they got it's not just people that, fans that are pissed off. There's people that that like us, that work in the media, that the league was never straightforward with us about. And in considering they only gave these details 2 days before the game. So there's a big issue with that. This system of playoff qualification doesn't work, needs to be structured next year. While I'm at that, one of the big names that covers the XFL, Mike Mitchell, actually agrees that this system does not work. and maybe this is just something that they just need to look into in the off season. They got plenty of time to restructure things, but the way things really should have been done is the winner of each division automatically get in, and then you have 2 at-large positions, meaning Seattle and St. Louis would have got in, not Houston, Arlington. Because, I mean, I'm sorry, it's embarrassing that you see a 4-6 team in the playoffs when you've got 3 teams that actually did well and actually gave a crap about their games, only to have the Battlehawks miss out on it. So, and Mike Mitchell's been pushing for saying, hey, this wasn't right. And even then, the format for the playoffs should have been determined 3 or 4 weeks ago, not 2-3 days before all the, these games to determine who was going to get in. Big issue there. But outside of that, game-wise, amazing. McCarron, played like his future career played on it. Hopefully there were some NFL scouts paying attention. I don't want him to leave. I would love for him to come back. But obviously, he played like his life was at stake and got the win. And, it is not just him. He had some very reliable people in the offense, too. And to be fair, Dormady didn't have too bad of a game. It's just, dealing with the Battlehawks defense, they weren't able to put up a game like one of our colleagues was thinking they were going to put up. So, and the fact that the way that McCarron had played in that game, obviously, and we'll discuss that later considering the Player of the Week honors, but I'm just gonna stop now because I'm already gone to the point of long-winded.
So I guess with that said, I'll touch on the game first. The game. So obviously AJ played out of his mind, especially the second half. The first half, really, between the two teams was extremely entertaining and highly competitive. Whatever happened at halftime in both locker rooms probably could be like poster child material of what you should do at halftime for the Battlehawks and what you shouldn't do at halftime for the Guardians. The play just completely nosedived from the Guardians, went way up off the scale for the Battlehawks. They turned it up an extra notch and really deserved everything that they got out of that game. One of the coolest plays of the year, the Blandino got called again, and this time it scored a touchdown. So that was cool to see. It's nice. Both, the Blandino has a 100% effectiveness rate so far. Gained well over 100 yards, close to 150 yards, if I'm not mistaken, and a touchdown on 2 attempts. So who knows? The kicker might end up earning a quarterback contract if this keeps up. But, really good game. McCarron outplayed what Dormady did earlier this season with a 5-touchdown performance, tossing 6. So, easy game of the year, performance of the year, rather, out of the quarterback there. In terms of so Jake mentioned whether or not McCarron would come back. McCarron strikes me as just a good old boy wanting to play football. Like, he's made his millions in the NFL and he just wants to play until he's done. So I don't know that he would necessarily go back to the NFL unless it's a starting position. And to be honest, I don't really see that a whole lot. He obviously is far and away the best quarterback in the XFL. I don't think that's even debatable. Second place, you're talking an argument between Teamu and DiNucci. But really, I don't see McCarron going back to the NFL. I think he's going to be here for the long haul. I think he wants his kids to see him play and see him be successful. And I think that's part of a lesson that he's teaching his kids. He seems like a really humble guy. So but that's just my opinion on it.
I think when it comes to that scenario, I actually agree with you, Jiru. If he did somehow go back to the NFL, he'd probably be riding pine. I don't see him playing at all if he goes back.
Right, and I think that's an important thing for him. Is his kids? That was one of the big motivators in that first game interview. After they pulled off the comeback against San Antonio in the Dome, not the Battle Dome, in the Alamo Dome, was, I wanted my kids wanted to watch me play. He said they came to me, said, "Daddy, we want to watch you play," and he basically made it happen. So I think there's a little bit more at play for him than there is, for other people, in terms of emotional reasons for being there. When it comes to the playoffs, I am way on the other end of the spectrum from Mr. Jake here. I'm very much in the camp of you can't take your ball and go home after the season's said and done if you didn't make it, if you didn't cut it for what you signed up for. St. Louis had a great season. They had a really good season. It came down to 5 points. It'd be like that sometimes. You didn't make it out of your conference. That's the way it was designed from the very start. Everybody understood the rules, at least as far as if you were in the XFL. Maybe not the media types, obviously not the media types. Thanks ESPN for killing your own ratings. But I won't harp on that too much. Just in my opinion, just deal with it. In the NFL, you get losing teams in the playoffs as well. It's not like this is some new concept. Does Arlington deserve to be a playoff team? By the letter of the law, yes. In reality, probably not. After the season, more than open to seeing rules changed and things like that, but you're never going to hear me, gripe, moan, and complain because we played by the rules and lost. That's, to me, if you play by the rules and you lose, then suck it up. Better luck next year.
Personally, I'm gonna just hang out on this one. I don't really have an opinion, to be honest with you.
Ryder.
I mean, I'm happy with the results, regardless if Houston would have been in or not.
Right.
It's all about the XFL to me, and if this was the XFL Roughnecks podcast, then I'm sure we would be upset if our team didn't make it, but it's not. So, yeah. I mean, I agree with parts and aspects of what both of you say. My thing is like you say, Drew, the rules were set, things were met. That's how things are. I mean, we're not going to change reality to please a few. I do feel like that things could improve, but that's something you do in the off season, and it's not something you rush to do to please a few talking heads. Now, in terms of the media, much of the alt media had these predictions correct, such as us, such as Matty Fresh, such as Mike Mitchell. A lot of these guys were working on this stuff hand and foot, trying to get us the right info. And what we got came from them. And when it changed, we changed it. And I mean, so I understand where you're coming from, Jake, on that aspect. That's what I'm going to preach here is people need to stop listening to ESPN in terms of a whole and gather their own research. It's just like news channels. Let's get our own news. Let's not take it all from one source. Right. That's my opinion.
And especially when it's something that is new, ESPN's not just going to, like, for example, ESPN was on the Ocho or whatever ESPN network it was, had like the Cornhole Championships on, right? They're not going in depth into scenarios and, point scoring and stuff like that for the Cornhole Championships. They're probably getting maybe 100K viewers, if that. So what are you, if you're looking to ESPN for news, that's one thing. If you're looking to ESPN for information, you have to be very, very careful if it's not a statistical set of information.
Boom.
And
that's
when
it.
you're talking about playoffs and playoff scenarios, a lot of times playoff scenarios are very straightforward because there's a long season, there's a longer process than just 10 games with 8 teams, and things are more evenly figured out. Hell, honestly, in the past with 8-team setups or even 10-team setups, things are played out pretty straightforward, and you don't get into deep tiebreakers. This just happened to be two teams that were so evenly matched during the season that you got to that level of tiebreakers, and it played out on the field. So, ESPN really kind of just, threw their hat out in the wind and said, well, hopefully it doesn't get past tiebreaker 4. Well, anybody with a brain saw that it was, very possible that it was going to get past tiebreaker 4. So bad on ESPN there, all the way. I think they'll learn from that. I think a little bit more evaluation probably would have saved their cake, obviously, but I don't think that they ruined the cake or ruined the birthday party, so to speak. It is what it is. Moving forward, whether or not there's change, it's not really going to matter to ESPN. They're probably going to have it called a little bit better next year, I would imagine. It's probably also not going to make it to tiebreaker 5 or 6 next year. So
I'm just going to add 2 more things. There's a reason why ESPN has the reputation of being the worldwide misleader in sports. Second point, good on Houston for getting in. It also helped that you guys had a pretty shitty division to begin with the terrible performance of your 3 other compadres within that conference, 2 of them in the same state.
It's 2 of the best defenses in the league, though. Let's be real. It wasn't exactly a cakewalk, really, for anybody, not named DC. And for DC, it wasn't even a cakewalk. They have a lot of close wins that probably could have been losses. So overall, parity in the league is actually pretty good for as much as people crap on both sides. Granted, the offense was definitely not there in the South Division. The offense was way off the table. The talent level was pretty low on offensive side of the ball for most of the squads. The product definitely could have been a lot better in the South Division, but when you're playing against defenses like those, it's not exactly easy.
Very good points, fellas. Very good. Everything we're saying is shared testaments amongst the people that are fans of your team, my team, or the Battlehawks, whatever. I feel you, Jake. I really do.
Yeah, it does suck to be on the losing end of something as trivial as the 5th tiebreaker, especially by like 5 points. It's really easy to feel snubbed, but at the end of the day, at least you have the same level of participation in the championship game and playoffs as everyone else. You can at least buy tickets. If anybody on the Battlehawks is interested in being there, really, if anybody outside of the playoff teams is interested in being in the championship, that's what they have to resort to now because they didn't make it. So,
and then there's always the hope that DC and Seattle will suck next year. So,
also facts. Who gets picked up for the NFL? Nobody knows.
Yep, we won't know until the playoffs. The championship game's over with. We don't know when the date's actually going to start for them to start signing new contracts and whatnot. All I can say is they better not be 1-year deals like they were this year. This year made sense for it to be 1-year contracts because they were starting again from scratch. Next year, we need to be at least looking at 2 to 3 year contracts because 1-year contracts year to year, like the USFL likes to do with 80% of their contracts, that's not going to cut it in the XFL.
No, but what I do agree with that the XFL has done is the flat pay for the players. I think honestly that's a fair deal because everyone's getting the same opportunity. Everyone's they're falling into this bucket of trying to get back to the league, and they have to realize that at this point they're not really professional players. They're semi-pro. So they're trying to work their way back to pro. But, making $60,000 a year, maybe that number goes up if the XFL shows that it was profitable and shows good futures in terms of betting markets for viewership and things like that when the big picture bets come out. Maybe that's a direction that they go, but I agree with you 100%. They can't just stick one-year contracts on everybody. I think they've got to have multi-year deals. But with that said, they have to have NFL clauses. So if someone wants to get picked up by the NFL, that's got to be allowed. That you cannot you can't have somebody get called up by the NFL and say, oh, well, they're on contract, you have to wait, NFL. That's not how you continue to build off of the platform that XFL has built itself on to this point.
And that's where I agree with you on there. For anything that it would almost have to exercise the set. If there's going to be multiple year contracts, they definitely need to be exercising the same method as they used in the NHL, a two-way contract. So you could technically still be on contract with the XFL, but it would also allow for them to play up the team that they end up playing for, pay them major league pay, but then whenever they're on the bench long enough where they're just not of any use, then send them back to the XFL. That's the best way of using the partnership between the NFL and the XFL. And then at the same time, bringing in people from the IFL, because I didn't see a single person, and I could just be mistaken, but I don't recall any people from the IFL coming in this season, and we need to figure out how to best utilize that one next season as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of different places that people can come in from, and I think the XFL is already looking at that, especially with the way that they do their recruiting. But I do agree with you. The two-way contracts, if somebody goes up to an NFL squad, ends up on the practice squad for a certain amount of time, or doesn't, if they get cut, then the XFL teams probably should retain the rights to those players for however long that contract goes. So I think those discussions probably have already been had since they're planning the new XFL season. I would imagine there will be some news come out about that. I don't see them going flat into one-year contracts again next year, especially not with whispers of 2025 expansion starting to creep around. So,
yeah. Speaking of 2025, come on, bring back Chicago. I want that I-55 rivalry.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see a couple teams move around this offseason. That's just my opinion. And as well as a lot of these identities of teams, such as players, will be gone because they're going to be moved around, if not the NFL teams. That's just my opinion, though. I'm gauging my stuff off of spring ball from the past few years. The few guys that were always decent, they were snatched up very quickly.
Yeah, all of the XFL teams, the franchises, are up for sale right now. So honestly, if somebody were to buy Houston, it would be their prerogative if they wanted to move Houston.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I don't know that they would, because Houston, had, increasing numbers this year. In the previous iteration of the XFL, they were, I think, second or third out of the 8 teams in terms of viewership, or not viewership, but attendance. So, Houston seems to be a positive trend and one that's pretty safe. Who knows if Orlando would stay in Orlando, right? Who knows if Vegas wouldn't go back to LA and become the Wildcats again? Who knows? So, but that's more news stuff. We didn't touch on that because I don't think it's actually really news, but it is worth mentioning, at the point that we're at right now. So.
All right, fellas, let's move on. Jake, I see your hands up. Do you got anything else before we move on? Anything to leave us with? Good to go?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Okay, just making sure. All right, guys, I appreciate the insights on that game, as well as just discussing the future of the XFL and contracts. It's not really a conversation that we've had, so it's good that we're discussing it. And I love that we're all cordial. Good job.
It took everything we had.
Next up, let's discuss the DC Defenders. They took down the San Antonio Brahmas. Oh, they barely took them down. 29-28. That game came down to a missed field goal by the best kicker in the XFL. Guys, you got anything you want to share?
He got froze. The freeze timeout actually worked for once. And if we hadn't heard enough about the playoffs before, if San Antonio would have made it and Arlington would not have, there would have been a lot more people talking to about that very same thing, because San Antonio basically would have backed into it. It would have almost gone to the same amount of tiebreakers that the Seattle and St. Louis race went to. San Antonio, the last couple of games, really played for their playoff life. Like, I was proud of them. They really came around on offense. They started putting things together. They got risky on defense. Their defense really stepped up in the same vein that Houston's did and had a couple of scores. I mean, San Antonio looked like a very formidable team. You know, regardless of their offensive woes overall, they had a couple of good moments. But regardless of those offensive woes, they hung in there. They believed in themselves. Their coach believed in them, and they really gave the best team in the league a tough look. Now, Arlington did the same thing the week before in week 9, if you remember, and dang near won. They went to overtime. Barlow hadn't called that first time out, then we would be singing a very different tune because that kick actually went in. So, you know, DC seems to have really fallen off, and you know, I don't want to get into the preview of the championship game or the North championship game yet, but there's some potential for shakeup, and DC's got some things to figure out.
What'd you think about it, Jake? Did you actually watch this one?
I did not, but I will state one thing, and I know it's going to probably offend some people in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, but guess what? It's got to be said. Between all people whose last name is Romo, despite the whiffed kick at the end of the game, John Parker Romo is still by miles, despite the fact that they play two completely different positions, he's still better than Tony Romo.
Now you're trolling.
Yeah. He's giving him a hard time
somebody's got to, and what better it be somebody who was originally from Texas to troll the DFW.
No, believe me, I enjoy a fantastic troll, and that, sir, I want to see you say that more on more platforms.
Oh, trust me, I troll enough of the MLS teams out of Texas, so.
What'd you guys think of the defense? Well, you didn't watch, Jake, but Drew, yeah, I thought DC's defense looked pretty good compared to past games.
They did. It's not very hard when you're dealing with an offense that operates at the level of San Antonio. San Antonio stepped up and made plays. The addition of Nick Hawley's been really big. It's been a catalyst for their offense. Now, granted, you know, it hasn't really caused an offensive explosion per se, but they're a little bit harder to deal with. So, you know, DC stepped up and did a pretty good job. They played good against Arlington too. They shut Arlington out for 3.5 quarters, essentially, you know, other than a couple field goals or other than, I think it was 9 points before that comeback started. But their defense played good, but I don't think it played at the same level that they've played all year. Their defense, if nothing else, has been consistently average. Their offense has been really what's won them games. And that's a pattern that we saw in the original iteration, or not the original, but the last iteration of the XFL, where offenses really came around late. And if you had a good offense early, then you were really in good shape. That's why Houston was really in good shape for as long as they were before the season got canceled. So it was, yes, it was kind of impressive, but taking into effect the whole picture and who they were playing, I don't find it too terribly impressive.
10-4. What did you think about Jordan Tamamu? I thought he had a pretty good game, though. I mean, compared to past games, it was close enough that we didn't know what was happening, but we saw some pretty good play. So, I mean, I was impressed with DC. I'm still impressed with DC.
I mean, Tamamu's a smooth operator. He was a smooth operator in St. Louis the first time around. I mean, that can't be denied. I think their offense really became a well-oiled machine as the season went on. They've really found a formula that works. They've got playmakers that do exactly that, and they do it at different times. You know, if one guy's having a bad game or isn't playing up to snuff, then a guy like Lucky Jackson will step up, or you know, whatever the case may be. So that's the thing with DC is on offense, they've got the pieces. They are a chess team playing against checkers players. It's pretty fun to watch. Their defense leaves a lot to be desired.
So I got a question for you guys. We talked about McCarron and potentially his future plans after this season, though. So I might as well just go ahead and go right out with the Tamu thing. Do you think he goes back to the NFL? And if he does, do you think he plays backup, or do you think he's going to ride Pine to where it's a waste of his time? Or do we potentially see him in the off season? Someone calls him up over at the USFL, which wouldn't be the first time he'd been there. So what are you guys thinking on that?
I don't see him going USFL. I think the XFL has proof of concept of being a path to the NFL. I mean, you look at a guy like PJ Walker, who went to Carolina, started 4 games this year, is still on an active NFL roster as a backup and making good money, making more than he would make in the XFL. I think Teamu probably will get a solid look. I imagine he'll be picked up as some kind of free agent to a practice squad. You'll probably see that with DiNucci as well. I don't see DiNucci sticking around. I think he's going to chase the money, if there is any to be made when you throw 12 interceptions in a season of 10 games. But interceptions aside, man, sorry, every time I mention DiNucci, I have to mention interceptions. It's like a bug in my brain. There's going to be a few quarterbacks that get looks. I think Teamu's one of them. I think he'll probably stick around on a practice squad for a little bit, but ultimately, I don't necessarily think his skill set translates to the style of game the NFL plays, unless he goes somewhere like Washington, maybe, where he's going to have to run around and has an offensive coordinator that's used to a quarterback that runs around. Teamu usually is a little bit more of a pocket passer, but the kind of opportunity that he would get would probably be on a low end team that doesn't have a lot of protection for him. And I think the circumstances would have to be a little bit extenuating for Teamu to make it. He's a great talent. I just don't think that he's the style of quarterback that really could succeed in NFL systems.
And you know what I mean? It looks like right now the Packers are looking for a quarterback, since they just traded theirs off to the New Jersey Jets, because that's where they're at. They don't have the right to call themselves the New York Jets. Like I said, Packers are hiring.
Yeah, there's a lot of NFL teams, quote unquote, hiring right now. Here's the thing: is Teamu's a competitor. If he gets a chance, he's going to give it everything he has. And if he goes somewhere that's low on the talent pool, like maybe a Washington, because they've got Sam Howell, and then who? I don't think there's not very many people that aren't Washington fans that can name who Sam Howell's backup is right now, right? So, there's opportunities. I don't see an opportunity that would be beneficial for Teamu, honestly. It could change after the draft, depending on how teams draft. But I don't know. But at the same time, you never count them out, because you look at what the Ravens built around Lamar Jackson. It only took them a couple years to build that. And Lamar Jackson, I don't know. He's very good. I don't know if he would be successful in other offenses because of the level of detail that Baltimore put into building that system around him. So maybe Teamu would be that same type of guy that would need that system built around him. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe I'm completely wrong. Is just the way I see it, and some of the struggles that Teamu had earlier in the season. I think when you're playing against NFL defenses, it's really gonna drop down that production significantly.
Yeah, I don't see him translating to a starter in the NFL in any degree. That's just me. He's already had the chance with the Chiefs, I believe, and a couple other teams.
Yeah,
but he would be a backup for sure. Going forward, we had Jack Cohn. He did pretty good. What did he have? I lost his stats. My bad. Jordan Tamamu's stats. He had 22 attempts. He had 15 completions for 271 yards with 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. So that's a solid game for him. Nothing good,
Yep.
Nothing too bad. But anyway, fellas, let's move on to our next game. That's the Houston Roughnecks. They defeated the Arlington Renegades for a second time, 25-9. That game was in Arlington. I enjoyed it, but then again, it's going to make for a rough playoff game. What you got, Drew?
I don't think it was a clinic by any means. This was a weird game to watch. I don't know how it got the second most. I think it was the second most viewership. Honestly, I don't know how it wasn't in the cellar, honestly, especially knowing that San Antonio had lost to DC. I thought both teams probably would play their starters and give it a full go. It seemed like all throughout the game, both teams were like salt-based sprinkling starters into the fold, and not. Luis Perez was on the field for a while, not on the field for a while, back on the field. He played till the very end. I thought he got hurt on the last play. Maybe he was just sitting there because he was upset because he couldn't make the play. He was definitely slow to get up. Houston pretty much didn't start Silvers, and then that was it. That the rest of them were basically starters. They gave Tim Ward a start so he could play on defense and get back in playing shape. I think he's been back in playing shape for a little while. They were saving him for the playoffs. But talking to Coach Stewart, the defensive coordinator, before last week's game against Vegas, he was saying that Tim Ward was basically just getting back to able to protect himself. So I believe Coach Ward, when you're a defensive end, especially a big guy like that, those offensive linemen really like to come at you. So you've got to be able to defend yourself. So with a shoulder injury, you've got to really be careful when you bring somebody back. So, Tim Ward may have been ready for a while, but I think the coaching staff was protecting him a little bit too. So, but weird game. Starters and non-starters playing. I don't think either team. I mean, obviously Houston seemed a little bit more into it than Arlington did, but overall it was kind of a throwaway game. Neither team wanted to. I mean, you heard Luis Perez in one of the sideline interviews saying, "Yeah, like we're being very vanilla right now on purpose. We probably want to save, one of these plays or one of these calls." I mean, it was very clear that there was gamesmanship going on, but that some of the younger guys were getting their opportunities, or some of the guys that are lower on the depth chart were getting their opportunities in this game.
I've seen, who was it? LB? Was that our backup? That's the first time I've seen him on the field. Is that correct?
Yeah, Caleb Ellaby out of Washington State. Yep.
And then we had Jeremy Cox, I believe that was his name.
That was actually a big performance for Cox. Like
and that's what I meant by
man among boys.
Yeah, he looked really good. What did he have? I think 130 yards rushing, which was also a game record for a Roughnecks running back. Surprising, huh?
Yeah, he had 70 yards in the first quarter.
Wow.
It was nuts.
So all in all, not a bad game. We'll talk more about what we expect for next week. But Jake, you got anything you want to add to this before we move on?
Not necessarily. I mean, I didn't exactly watch it. I did watch parts of it, but I didn't stick around for the whole game. But I think the outcome I probably wasn't exactly surprised about.
Okay, let's review one more matchup, and then we'll have Jake Tribbey joining us. He should be joining the call any moment, so don't be surprised. Let's talk about the Vegas Vipers. They did not stand a chance against the Seattle Sea Dragons on Sunday. They lost 9-28. That game was in Seattle. To me, it looked like the Vegas offense just sputtered out and gave up. That's my opinion. I believe they could have put more points up, but it didn't really look like we wanted to be out there. What do you guys think?
Well, the first half, I think Vegas came out hot, right? And I'm going to say something here that, I've been pretty hard on Ben DiNucci as far as him doing some classless things. Vegas thought that this was a great game to come out and just trash talk Seattle before the game. And when you're dealing with a team that's lost a teammate, a brother, that's about as classless as it gets. More classless, in my opinion, than standing over somebody when they're knocked out. I mean, hot take, whatever you want to call it. Have some professionalism, have some class. Those guys were already dealing with a lot. You just don't do that to people. But with that said, Vegas got their just desserts. They looked like crap on offense. It was, their defense played great until they had been on the field forever, and they failed again. It was basically the story of the season for them for the most part. You could really tell that they were missing their offensive tackle that had got hurt last week against Houston. McClendon, he started getting hit. He started making some rough decisions or having no time to make decisions again. The defense really played their butts off for Seattle. The offense really started clicking in the second half. It looked like they were going to score 30, 40 points. Nobody really knew. But I think that Seattle probably knew that they had done enough to to secure their spot in the playoffs at that point. And really, we're just counting on their defense to hold on to it for them and trying to waste time on offense, play a little bit of conservative game, run some time down, and get out of there with the dub.
Now, did Ben DiNucci, did he throw any picks this game? I'm trying to find his stats now as we speak.
He threw one for sure. I think he threw two.
That's going to be big for them coming up. Regardless of who they play, is his way to hand that ball over, in my opinion. This is a solid team in Seattle, and we've been saying it for weeks and weeks now. And in my opinion, they're one of my favorites for the championship.
Yeah, me too. I think the biggest thing with so if you had to compare Seattle to a comic book villain, they're probably Two-Face. Like, Ben DiNucci is their best player, but also their biggest detriment in terms of turnovers. So they're really going to have to play a squared away game against DC to do well. But we'll get into that here in a few minutes.
Yes, sir, no doubt. DiNucci, he threw for 339 passing yards. That was his third 300-yard plus game this season, and also the most in the XFL. We'll see what happens, but I'm excited for the Seattle fans as well as the players. Jake should be joining us. Jake Tribbey should be joining us any minute, and we're going to discuss this week's matchups. It's going to be a little shorter since we only have 4 teams to talk about.
Yeah, I think we pretty much touched on everything in terms of reviewing the games. Honestly, we created more for the news section after doing the news section. So
no doubt. Yeah, I'm not going to edit that either. That's just where it is.
No, for sure. It's good content. Anytime that you have something, I mean, when you have a season that was honestly, like, objectively as good as this season was for the XFL, such a good, I mean, it was a viewership success. It was an attendance success in terms of overall attendance across the league. Thank you, St. Louis. Carrying
Seriously
over 30% of the total attendance for the league is a huge deal.
No doubt. Cacao, I'll give you all one.
So I will tell you, since we kind of discussed it in brief, I believe, like, when it comes to teams moving around for the next season, I believe that Vegas had pushed out their season tickets about the same time as St. Louis. So it does look like that they ended up having a 2-year deal at Crapman Field. So unfortunately, it looks like we've got a whole new seasons of games to look for in the Toilet Bowl and have our second annual Toilet Bowl, hopefully second and final, so that potentially they can end up playing at if hopefully when it's over, they can either play at the facilities at UNLV or they can get a deal with the NFL and play in their facility. If they can't get a deal there, then yeah, I could probably see relocation happening.
I want to welcome Jake Tribbey to the podcast. Jake is a Writer of the Year for Fantasy Sports Writer Association. He works for Fantasy Points. Jake, could you just share a little bit more about yourself before we roll into the game previews?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a staff writer for fantasypoints.com, and I, specialize mostly in daily fantasy. So I write a lot about, DraftKings.com, the contests you can play on there, and some betting stuff as well. Right now, obviously, a big focus on spring football, XFL, USFL, because that's what's in season. But I also do plenty of NFL writing as well.
Well, we're glad to have your expertise, Jake. The people at home, I mean, we talk about betting. We don't really talk about fantasy aspects much, but both are useful to know. As well, as we're coming through this game, there's a lot less going on in terms of matchups and things happening. So we appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it, guys.
So let's go ahead and get right into it. Let's talk about the South Divisional Championship matchup. That's the Houston Roughnecks versus the Arlington Renegades. That game is Saturday, April 29th at 7 p.m. Eastern, and it takes place on ESPN 2. Oh, in terms of the Roughnecks, it's been a little bit choppy for us on offense. We've talked about the defense being pretty good, but that offense is rough. In terms of the Renegades, their whole season has been rough. We can say a few good things about them, but we can't really highlight on too many positives. Drew, Jake, what do you guys think about this matchup going forward?
Certainly an interesting matchup. I mean, it was very strange to me. This game didn't matter for either teams last week, and Arlington ended up playing their starters throughout and just couldn't get anything going offensively. Of course they weren't showing much. I mean, we heard Luis Perez during the game say, hey, you want me to avoid checking plays, adjusting plays at the line, and it was obviously a very simple attack, but this Houston defense, second best in terms of points per allowed, only 18.2 per game. And by far the best defense in the league in terms of both PFF coverage grades and pass rush grades. So while the offense has certainly looked, really choppy, the quarterback play has been iffy for sure. Man, this Houston defense has been nothing but consistent. And it's hard for me not to like Houston, straight up in this game. The betting markets are a little bit of a different story, given that, they're already favored by 6.5. So you are paying a pretty penny if you want to back Houston there. But man, I really like them in this contest. I mean, Arlington's looked better with Luis Perez, but this still isn't an offense I'm particularly excited about. Granted, they might be one of the few teams that can go toe-to-toe with Houston on the defensive side of the ball.
I feel pretty much the same way. Houston's offense has been in a funk ever since they played Seattle, ever since they lost John Trey Kirkland. I've covered it several times or mentioned it several times that not having a deep threat when you're in a run and shoot or air raid or whatever the case may be really takes the top off of that offense for the defense and makes defending you a whole lot easier. And I think we've seen that, and there may not be much that Houston can do about it. Houston can still score a few points, but relying on their defense to score points is definitely not a way to get a championship won in terms of the XFL championship. In terms of the South Division championship, it may very well be enough to get it done. There's going to be some plays made by Arlington and by Luis Perez. Luis Perez has had a little bit more time in that system now. He's probably got some cards up his sleeve now that he's been there for close to a month. He probably feels a little bit more comfortable. Sal Cannella is always a problem at tight end. And Houston, I think, at least in my opinion, I'm sorry, Coach Reisig, for Houston, but I think the linebackers outside of Ellerby and Beckett really have not been a strong point, so to speak, for the defense. They've been a focal point in terms of scoring, but I don't think that they've been a strong point in terms of keeping coverage locked down. So I think Sal Cannella will probably get his. I think it'll be close for most of the game. Houston will, man, I almost want to say I'm going to stay away from this completely. I would imagine Houston's probably not going to cover just by virtue of not being able to score. I'm hoping that Silvers was correct in talking about after the Vegas game that he hadn't practiced a whole lot and he was finally going to get back to practicing and things like that. Maybe that's the cure for the offense because he hasn't practiced since week 5 or 6 when he messed up his shoulder. So, we'll see. Maybe that's a little hopium that I'm pumping into the air there, but I think Houston pulls it out. I don't think it's going to be any grand, huge must-watch game. I could be wrong, but I just don't see that happening. I think it's going to be a defensive struggle, and Houston's going to come out on top. So,
I agree a lot with what Drew said. I do think, for what it's worth, that there is a little bit of value to be had on the Arlington side of things. Either Arlington plus 6.5, or you can get Arlington plus 200 on the money line there. I have Houston futures to win the championship. Obviously, I'm wearing a Roughnecks hat, so I am a Houston backer, and that's not a bet I've taken personally, but like me and, some of the internal numbers that we have at Fantasy Points handicap this game at, closer to Houston being favored by 4, maybe 4.5. So yeah, I definitely think there's something to be said for there being some value on the Arlington side of things, and this probably being a close defensive struggle.
What's the overall point, the over under?
41 for this game, much higher for the North Championship, 48.5. So 41 we've seen this year, kind of a lower end of what a total would be in the XFL.
Right. Yeah. No, so first several weeks, I know we were looking at a lot of mid 30s or high 30s scores. So they're obviously not too high on either team's ability to score. So I think that's right around correct. I don't know that I would touch that either. If I had to guess, it would probably be an under.
Yeah, I'm curious if you guys, I mean, I know we've already touched on, Silver's not practicing potentially being, a culprit there, but Houston scoring, first 4 weeks, 31 points per game. Since week 5, though, only 21 points per game. Is there anything that like you guys have seen or could point to that would, be the result of that? Because to me, it's really just felt like all quarterback play. The quarterback plays really seemed as though it's fallen off since week 5, but I'm curious if you guys are seeing anything different.
Well, I think you're partially right. Well, by virtue of being 100% right, I think you're partially right there. Like I was saying, losing Jontre Kirkland was a huge deal. It turns out Deontay Burnett really, at least the way that they've been calling plays, is not the deep threat that they need to really open up the offense, right? I think that play calling a lot has been an issue. Now, whether or not that's had to do with what Silvers was capable of because he was injured or what McDonald was capable of in terms of actually running the offense, we don't know. I was a little frustrated, and Matt can attest to this. By a little frustrated, I mean a lot frustrated when McDonald played against, was it St. Louis? And it seemed like he basically was running the same stuff that Silvers was running. To me, I think it's a combination overall when you look at scoring of losing Kirkland and not really adjusting your play calling, where they're still calling deep shots. Silvers has thrown several interceptions on deep shots just to try and take the top off of the defense, and you just don't have it. The past week or two, they've been a little bit more forthcoming with trying to open up the deep play rather than, force it to somebody and hope that they'll prevail. That comes down to scheme. I think there was some good coaching, especially week 9, trying to get those guys open against. I mean, teams are basically bracketing Deontay Burnett and leaving everything underneath. So I think you've got to take advantage of that, and you've got to run a lot of very specific. Really, Houston's been getting beat by the zone. So man defense, Houston can tear apart. That's what the air raid and all those offenses are meant to do. The zone, when you don't have a top threat, you've got to run very specific plays that limits you, and it really reins you in. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing. It's a combination of play calling and just losing your best player.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Really appreciate that insight.
Yeah, I agree there. I was going to say injuries number 1. Secondly, being the scheming from those injuries. We just don't have the personnel there for what they want to do, and we really haven't adjusted, in my opinion. The few times we've seen some decent productivity. For example, like this week, I like the run game. Jeremy Cox had, 120 yards and 2 touchdowns or something. I mean, he did really good. And so Max Borghi has the opportunity there, as well as Bryson Allen, to do some things on the ground. And as a fan and an analyst, I'd like to see them more active, whether it be in read plays or just actually running the ball. Like, get them going, get them guys moving.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I would agree with. I think the only problem for this week is that Arlington is by far the toughest run matchup in the XFL. PFF's highest graded run defense, and they're only allowing about 75 rushing yards per game. That makes the ground and pound approach a little tricky, but, we saw them do it last week. Arlington played their starters, and, RB3 Jeremy Cox was running all over them. So, maybe with Borghi back there, they could do even more damage. It's hard to say, but that was also really the only game we've seen all year where they were pretty aggressive running the ball. It was more of a spread to run approach rather than, the typical pass first approach that we normally see. It'd be interesting to, see if they do recreate that in the semifinals here.
And if you think back to the first game against Arlington this year, Max Borghi had a big game against Arlington too, not just on the ground, but in the passing game as well. And the way I see the injury reports coming out, it seems like Sage Doxeter is ready to come back on the offensive line. So that gives a little bit more of a road grader approach. It gets the offensive line back to normal, and maybe that solves some of Silver's problems too, because it's hard to throw touchdowns when you're sitting on your ass. Having him back is going to be a big deal if he can come back. But I think Houston's done well adjusting at the micro level. I think macro, there's probably a little bit more work to be done. Maybe they've been sitting on some things, knowing that they could probably just coast a little bit. Who knows? I don't know. You're right. It's going to be tough to run on them, but it's going to be tough to pass on them too. First off, it's a playoff game. You're talking about guys that do have NFL talent, so it's not going to be easy. But I don't see the offense having some sort of explosion at all.
Yeah, and that probably plays into a little more of potentially backing the under there. 41 points. It's really hard for this, to see this game being a shootout, especially when compared to, a game like DC versus Seattle.
Right.
In terms of the Renegades, are there any names you guys are watching? Anybody specifically we need to be looking for?
Perez and Canella. I mean, if Perez and Canella can get something going and keep it going for a decent swath of the game, they've got a chance to knock Houston off. I mean, but it's gonna have to be the offense. The defense can't win the game because Houston's defense is gonna match them step for step if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it comes down to Silvers for me. I mean, if Silvers is on it, I mean, there's just no way Arlington wins this game. I think that's the bottom line. If Silvers plays like a lot of the games he's played these past 4 or 5 weeks, it's gonna be a really close one. So yeah, I think to me it probably just comes down to Brandon Silvers and how well he's able to execute this passing game.
Yeah, we've been preaching that since week 2 about Houston. I mean, so we're right there with you, bro.
Arlington's secondary is not something to be messed with. They showed that against Orlando. They showed that against DC. Those guys fly around and they make plays and they make them when they matter. So I don't see any way around this being a close game, but I do think that if Arlington wins, they're going to have to get something going on offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one thing that we've seen and that the betting markets have been very slow to pick up on is when teams go through one of these quarterback changes. I mean, we know from watching the league, it drastically changes the offense. But sportsbooks, seemingly just price things as if there was no quarterback change. So that's been one of the biggest edges in betting so far this year. And I think the Arlington spread is sort of reflective of that, where, if you judge them on their entire body of work, maybe a 6.5 point spread makes sense here. But the offense with Luis Perez has just looked a lot better. I mean, even Perez on a bad day has looked better than Sloter and Kevin Anderson. So,
yeah,
I think that kind of sort of plays into the idea that there may be a slight edge betting on the Arlington side of things.
For sure.
No doubt. Now, I know you talk a lot about the fantasy aspects, Jake. Are there any players on the low? Anybody cheap that you're looking at here?
Yeah, one of the guys that I'm the most interested in here is actually Bryson Aline. I mean, 2-game slates are always really tricky, and you're typically, picking some guys here and there who, aren't, your standard starters. But Aline's only, I think, 4,200 on DraftKings this week, which is a ridiculously cheap price for a guy who the team deemed so important that he only did kickoff returns last week. I mean, I don't believe he got a single offensive snap. It was all Jeremy Cox. And that hurt me a bit in DFS because I was sort of anticipating they're going to bench Borghi, and then Aline will be the guy to get most of the work, and Cox will sort of rotate in a little bit. If they like Aline so much that he, didn't play at all in week 10, I think him getting 30-40% of backfield work in, what is on paper a tough matchup, but could be a matchup that Houston could easily exploit, given their previous success here. I think he's a really sneaky play for the 2-game slate. And then another guy who I'm interested in, who I've written up week after week, and he really hasn't done much since the Seattle game, is Justin Smith. Justin Smith is a guy who the coaching staff just talks so highly about. He's our fastest receiver. He's one of our best players. I mean, preseason, A.J. Smith said that he thought he was right there with Jontre Kirkland and Deontay Burnett as the best receiver on the team. And we just really haven't seen it. At the same time, he's out there for every route. I mean, he's running a route on every play, and he's pretty cheap. And those are generally the guys that I like to look at in DFS, especially on such a short slate, only 4 total teams this week. So a guy who's going to be out there for every play, even if his target share isn't great, is certainly somebody I'm going to be looking at for DFS. So I would say those would probably be my 2 main targets. Granted, I wouldn't be surprised if either guy burned me pretty bad this week.
Now, scheme-wise, I think you're probably onto something with Justin Smith, because against a big physical secondary that likes to ball hawk and make plays, you really want to go to your bigger targets that are more secure. And Justin Smith's been that this year for Houston in tight spots. He's one of the bigger guys. I think he's the only guy that's over 6 foot flat in Houston's receiver core. And long, rangy guy. You saw that one-handed catch, the kind of juggling catch that he made on the sidelines 2 weeks ago. The guy, he's just solid. He doesn't make crazy, over the top long scoring plays, but they go to him when they're in a pinch. And against a secondary like Arlington's, you definitely need guys like that, and you need to lean on guys like that. So I think you're probably onto something there.
Yeah, and I mean, for DFS, he's the guy outside of Jontre Kirkland, who we know, obviously isn't on the active roster anymore. I mean, he's the guy with the highest average depth of target on the team. So, they really haven't connected on a ton of these deep shots so far, but at his price, he's right around 4,500, I think. One 60-yard reception, and he pretty much gets you there. So,
Yep.
Definitely the kind of guy that I like to target in some of these larger field DFS tournaments.
Appreciate that. Sounds good. Jake Leonard, before we move on, did you have any comments? I didn't want to move on unless if you had something to say.
I'll keep it straightforward because I'm just going to say it about the other game too. That way I don't have to repeat it later. I would rather lick a frozen power pole than take any action on any of these games this weekend. End of story.
Understood, sir. Understood. Okay, let's move on to the North Divisional Championship game. That game is the Seattle Sea Dragons versus the DC Defenders. It's Sunday, April 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern, and it takes place on ESPN. I feel like this is going to be a shootout, fellas, and probably our best game of the week. DiNucci, Tamamu. We got some good names here, and I'm really, really, really excited about this matchup. What do y'all think?
Jake, you can get after it, man.
All right. I really like the Seattle side of things. Right now, Seattle is a 3-point underdog, total here 48.5. I think on a neutral field, Seattle's probably favored by a point, maybe 2 points. Obviously, DC with a pretty strong home field advantage there. I was in DC for their week 9 matchup against Arlington. I mean, it's just an awesome environment. At the same time, though, Seattle, since I'd say probably about week 4, week 5, has been playing as, probably the best team in the XFL. Finished the season, first in points allowed, and obviously, one of the best scoring offenses in the league. I think DiNucci's looked a lot better these last few weeks. Really struggled with turnovers early on, but has looked significantly better. And Teamu's playing well too, but I do think this is a DC defense that is very exploitable. I mean, Craig Williams is an extremely aggressive defensive coordinator, but their pass defense by yards allowed has been, the weakest in the XFL so far. So because they blitz so much, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for DiNucci to connect on some of these deep shots. And I mean, I like Seattle straight up, plus 155 on the money line. I like Seattle plus 3. I'm pretty much all over Seattle this week. I think they're being undervalued a bit in the betting markets and overall in the public's eye.
Yeah, I think, at least in my opinion, anytime you see a 3-point or under spread for a home team, that people aren't very sure what's going to happen, and there's a lot of potential for an upset. So looking at Seattle, obviously their offense has absolutely come alive after the first couple of weeks of the season. It really kicked off against Houston, and then they just kept going from there. My problem with picking Seattle, at least heads up, is DiNucci's mandatory interception. I mean, in terms of his game only, I love the way DiNucci plays. I love the old riverboat gambler. I don't care if I throw interceptions, like Brett Favre type mentality. I'm just going to gun it, right? Love that. But if that is your best player, you're hard pressed to really win a league unless you have a whole bunch around you. And I think the whole bunch around DiNucci can't overcome his interceptions at sometimes. So that was the same story with Brett Favre a lot. Like, the Packers had really good teams several years. He just made mistakes, and that was who he was. So DC's defense, definitely exploitable. They've been bang average all year. I mean, you saw the offensive production that Orlando put up against them. Granted, nobody had tape on Dormady that week, right? That was his first step in, so it was a little bit of an exercise in the unknown. But overall, that defense hasn't been all that impressive. They definitely skewered Houston when Houston went to DC. It was a fun game to be at, but it wasn't a fun game to be at. But they haven't really played out of their skins, so to speak. Whereas Seattle's had several defensive performances where they've absolutely shut people down. I mean, they just tore Vegas a new one as far as defense versus their offense. It's happened several times. I mean, Houston was on a roll. Granted, they lost John Trey Kirkland in that matchup against Seattle early in the season, but Houston was on a roll to that point, and they put the brakes on Houston. So, I mean, I like Seattle's defense better. I just think that DiNucci probably is prone enough to turnovers or bad decisions that's going to come back to haunt them, and DC is going to end up winning. The home field advantage, I think, is too much. It'll cause some problems. Yes, it's a small stadium, but they are right on top of you in that stadium. That stadium is perfect for semi-pro football. So, I mean, it's going to be tough sledding for Seattle, but this one has the potential to be a classic for sure.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm right there with you on the turnovers. I mean, 19 turnover-worthy plays for DiNucci this year, 7 more than the next closest player. I mean, that's basically 2 per game. I was at the Orlando Guardians game when they played Seattle. I went with a buddy, and I told him, like, look, DiNucci's a lot of fun to watch, but he's a lock to throw the worst interception you've ever seen at some point in this game, and boy, did he. So, yeah, that's the wild card, is that DiNucci's probably the most exciting quarterback to watch, and he makes a ton of great plays downfield and with his legs. But, man, those fumbles, those interceptions, it makes it tough.
Yeah, I was just going to note, these teams both are leading in almost every stat amongst offense. You got Ben DiNucci, number 1, Jordan Tamamu, number 2. In rushing, you got Abram Smith, 1. And then receiving, you got Ja'Cory Pearson, best pass catcher in the league, in my opinion. In terms of who we got to win, let's talk about that. Jake, since you're the guest, you said you got Seattle on this?
Yeah, I'm a big time Seattle backer this week. Last week on the Fantasy Points XFL breakdown, a DFS, mostly DFS show that I do with Chris Wecht, we sort of guessed the spreads of what we thought, some of these hypothetical playoff matchups could be. I thought Seattle was actually going to be favored. I thought it was going to be Seattle -1 at worst to pick them. So the fact that I can get Seattle +3 here makes it a pretty juicy bet to me.
I don't know. If I'm being honest, I'm definitely not spending any money on this one. But just the feeling that I get, I feel like it's going to be something like a 38-33 game. It's going to be a shootout. I think DC comes out on top just because Tiamu's not going to throw the ball to the other team. Doesn't seem to be a trend that he has, and you can't say that much for the other team. I think it'll probably turn out somewhat like the last game, but I think DC probably will separate a little bit. We saw how DC played the last 2 weeks, so we don't know if they've been sitting on anything or if they're really having problems. It could go either way, and that's definitely why I'm not touching it for sure.
Yeah, there's a few things occurring in DC. I saw they got rid of Armstead. Wasn't really sure why or what happened. Did you guys hear anything on that?
I did not.
Yeah, I don't have anything on that. I did think it was a very strange move to make right before the playoffs.
No doubt. Just wanted to check in. Now, let's talk about Ben DiNucci before we roll off. 20 pass touchdowns for the season and 13 interceptions total. There it is, fellas.
Like I said, it's a roll of the dice what you're going to get with DiNucci, but you can damn near every single time hit snake eyes on an interception. Like it's going to happen.
He has, for what it's worth, he has been a lot better only for turnover-worthy plays since week 7, and he's by far PFF's highest-graded passer since week 7. Jordan Talon actually second there. So I think he has gotten better. I think he's gotten a little more comfortable in the offense. But, yeah, I mean, he is pretty damn close to a lock to throw a pick this week.
Now, from an analytical standpoint, him and June Jones have been at odds several times this year when it comes to play calling. I mean, June Jones, obviously being the godfather of that style of offense, really is, largely set in his ways, I would say, probably. But it does say a lot about DiNucci's abilities that he's able to question the coach like that openly, and they're able to have that open dialogue. I think that does bode well for them from a chemistry standpoint, and I think that's really what you've seen develop, especially over the latter half of the season. One indicator of that really was when Seattle started the season, they were doing the same thing Houston was 2 years ago when June Jones was the head coach, was going for 3 every time when they would score a touchdown. And that stopped. They started going for 2 and 1 and started being a little bit more productive because of it. No doubt about it, DiNucci's a really good quarterback, and you're definitely looking at 2 of the 3 best quarterbacks in the league playing in this game. Those interception numbers, even over the last, or even since week 7, hasn't he thrown an interception in every game except for 1? Or was it every game?
I believe it's every game. 5 total interceptions. Next closest player is Dormady with 3.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, still been struggling with those interceptions. But it's nice to see the turnover-worthy plays come down a little bit. I do think he's been playing better these last few weeks. So, I mean, like you said, he's right there with A.J. McCarron as like the only quarterbacks in the league who have no benching risk at all. Like the team has a lot of faith in him, and I think he's proven that faith wasn't misplaced.
For sure.
In terms of fantasy aspects, Jake, what do we got here? I said Pearson. I figured he would be a hot name, but I mean, in terms of the cheap guys, what do you think?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think the Seattle backfield is pretty interesting here. I mean, I kind of thought we would see by this point in the season Philip Lindsay develop into more of a bell cow, sort of like we saw Morgan Ellison earlier in the year. But the team doesn't really seem to care for Lindsey a ton. I mean, he's only averaging about 2.5 yards per carry. We've seen Charlie Tamo Poa, I hope I'm saying that right, the RB tight end hybrid. He's getting like a good amount of their backfield snaps. TJ Hammonds, though, is a guy that I'm still pretty interested in. Only 4,000, and I mean, like he's averaging like 6.5 yards per carry. I believe he leads the league in yards per carry. He has no contact balance. I mean, he just flies straight back as soon as he gets hit. But he's been a pretty exciting player for them. And then the other thing I'm going to be keeping an eye on here is I still don't think we have full route data. I'm waiting for PFF to update so I can update some internal stuff. But I really want to check like how they broke down these routes on the outside, because that's something we've seen, like, kind of an unpredictable rotation there between Josh Gordon, Jawan Green, Damian Willis, and Jordan Vesey. Some of these guys will sort of peak around a 75% route share. We've seen weeks, Gordon was in the doghouse for a little bit. We've seen weeks where he was down to like 35%. It seems like Gordon's come back into favor. And a guy that I've been targeting for many weeks is Jordan Vesey. To me, it feels like the Seattle offense, especially in the red zone, like a third of their playbook is just throwing these fade routes up to guys like Vesey and Gordon because they're just these big bodies on the outside. Seems to be kind of a core tenet of June Jones' offense. So I've always really liked Vesey because he gets a lot of downfield targets and he gets a lot of red zone targets. Not too much outside of that. You can bank on Blake Jackson or Jabor Pearson getting more volume, but Vesey gets a lot of those high leverage targets that you really like to see. And then, Damian Willis last week didn't get a ton of run because he was coming off an injury. But he's super cheap, only 3,300. So that'd be another guy that I'd look at, assuming, he manages to practice and all that this week and, is active ahead of the finals, or semifinals, I should say.
I think it's interesting you mentioned Philip Lindsay, because if you watched Philip Lindsay in Denver, he was never really like a good power runner, right? He seemed like a piece to a spread offense that really hadn't developed in terms of offense. So Philip Lindsay coming in and not really taking over the game, I think kind of makes more sense to me. At first, I thought he was going to step in and take over just because he had been a fixture in the NFL for a while with a team like Denver. You really look at his body of work in Denver, and he was never a guy that was going to open up the pass by himself by running the ball, right? Regardless of the scheme that he was behind. And Denver ran both zone scheme and gap on down type stuff as well. So it's not as surprising to me that other guys like they're giving handoffs to the tight end running back hybrid guy. It makes a lot of sense to me that they're kind of spreading out those touches, and that's been a hallmark for Seattle all season, is spreading out those touches. Same with DC. I mean, you're when you're analyzing percentage shares of catches, that means there's a lot of catches to go around. So this is going to be a lot of fun to watch, I think.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that makes it, tough as a fantasy analyst, but probably more, wide open overall for fantasy. It's just the fact that they spread the ball around so much. I mean, we've got a very clear backfield rotation here, combined with, pretty flat target shares across the board. I mean, obviously, Jabor Pearson and Blake Jackson earning the majority of targets, but I mean, you've got 6 receivers who are, legitimate threats to, post a tournament winning fantasy score. And, another guy that I'm really keeping an eye on here is Brendan Knox, who's activated off IR last week, ended up being inactive for the Week 10 game, but we saw him, act as the lead running back in this offense in, weeks 1, and I believe he got hurt week 2, which enabled Morgan Ellison to sort of take over. If he's active, I mean, Lindsey is like totally dust. Like Lindsey probably won't play at all. Lindsey might be inactive if Brendan Knox is active. And Knox is a guy that I feel like has just been, totally forgot about in a lot of XFL fantasy circles, which probably means that his ownership would be super low. If he's actually active this week. So that's something I'll be keeping a close eye on is, does Seattle go into this game with both Knox and Lindsey or just one of those guys? Because I imagine there's probably only room for one.
What did you say the over-under was in this game? You said it was 48.5?
Yeah, 48.5. I've seen 48 in some places, 49 in others. But yeah, 48.5 I think is about the middle there.
I don't know. To me, that seems really low, but that almost makes me wonder if Vegas knows something that other people don't. I mean, when there's a line that low between two of the best offenses in the league, then something seems to be up. It's almost like they're inviting you to take the over. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue it both ways. I think typically in the NFL, like when we see these divisional rematches where teams are playing each other for the third time in a season, I think, odds makers typically lean towards the under there because they know, these teams are familiar with each other. They might put up a good defensive battle. And you could also argue, Seattle's the only team all season that's held DC to under 20 points. That was in week 2. At the same time, though, the last time these teams played, they combined for like 55, and they're the 2 highest scoring offenses in the XFL since week 6. So I'm not taking a side on the total. I think 48, 49 is about right. But I do think you could pretty easily argue it either way, that it's either 5 points too low or a couple points too high.
And that's another good point you bring up that I hadn't considered, was this being the third time that they play each other, and how that actually looks at this, if you want to call it semi-pro level with NFL talent versus at the NFL level with real NFL talent. Does it have that big of an effect as it normally does in the NFL games?
Yeah, that's the thing, is I'm really not sure. It's hard to say, and it's so different than the Arlington-Houston matchup because we saw Arlington and Houston obviously played last week, but neither team was really trying super hard, right? And then they also met earlier in the season, I want to say somewhere between week 1 and week 3, but Arlington didn't look anything like the current version of Arlington because they didn't have Luis Perez. So it's hard to really look back on the previous Houston-Arlington matchups and gain much knowledge from how they played each other. But I think, I'm probably going to go back tomorrow and rewatch some of these old Seattle DC games because I think there's probably a good amount you could learn about how these teams want to play each other from those 2 contests because, they're pretty much the same team from when they played those games.
Appreciate that info, Jake. All right, fellas. Well, that's going to sum it up for the game previews for this week. We appreciate you, Jake Tribbey, for coming on. Greatly appreciate it. Expertise is always welcomed and needed. So thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity, guys.
We welcome you. So anytime you want to come on or stay on, you come on, brother. All right, let's move on to the power rankings. Drew, can you give us our XFL Insider power rankings for this week?
It's going to be pretty quick. I'm looking at more body of work for the season since we are going into the playoffs. It's a little bit of a season wrap up, if you will, but I'll be pretty quick about it. Number 1, I got DC. Number 2, I got Seattle. Number 3, I got Houston. Number 4, I got Arlington. Number 5, I got St. Louis. I'm just kidding, Jake. I had to I had to troll you a little bit. No, DC, I think, still obviously very, very firmly in number 1 spot. Seattle at number 2, just because they did take care of business against St. Louis and then took care of business the last week of the season as well. St. Louis, I do have at number 3. I still have them as a better team than Houston. They beat Houston in Houston Stadium, and it wasn't really a super competitive game. So I think St. Louis rather is very clearly better than Houston. And then I have Houston at the number 4 spot. Arlington, I've got at number 5. It was very close for me between them and San Antonio because San Antonio really came on down to the wire. Really, honestly, both teams came on down to the wire, playing really good against DC in the last 2 weeks. Just unable to pull it off on both squads. Arlington had that overtime game where they lost basically on the last overtime try, and then San Antonio made a field goal, but it was frozen. They had the timeout called right before that, and then he missed the follow-up. So, a little bit of bad luck. I don't think it really would have changed too terribly much unless San Antonio came through and made the playoffs in that scenario. But yeah, Arlington 5, San Antonio 6, Vegas at 7. I think it really is something that Coach Smith said for Vegas after the Houston game, is he thought that they had the most talent top to bottom when the XFL started if you looked at the roster on paper. They had guys like Vic Beasley. They have all of that talent at wide receiver. And even with a no-name guy I won't say a no-name, but with a lesser-known guy in Badette coming around. I mean, the talent on Vegas's roster is obscene, and I don't think it's concerning that they couldn't really put it together. It's just interesting why they couldn't put it together. It would be interesting to be a fly on the wall in some of the coaches' meetings and things like that. but I do have them at 7. And then Orlando, they tried to get off the bottom. I think they made it off the bottom one week, and they just couldn't sustain it. I think it was a big learning curve for Coach Buckley and that staff, especially dealing with a lot of the mentalities and egos and stuff like that early in the season, having a little bit of a culture problem. And really, they did a good job at reining that in, though. They played a lot better as the season progressed. They just were not one of the better teams in the league, so they definitely stayed at the bottom. So quick recap is DC at 1, Seattle at 2, St. Louis at 3, Houston at 4, Arlington 5, San Antonio 6, Las Vegas at 7, and Orlando at 8.
Easy work right there, Drew. Appreciate it. Thank you. Sorry I doubted your skills.
Never again.
Okay, next up, let's talk about the ambushsports.net players of the week. Of course, this week in offense, we had A.J. McCarron, 429 total yards with 6 touchdowns. The man was on fire. Looked good. He played the best he could to get his team in the playoffs, but it failed, unfortunately. Defense should have stepped it up for the man. But regardless, hell of a game, hell of an athlete. I really wouldn't be surprised if he isn't the MVP, and that's my personal opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, how many times did he win I need to get better with our internal stats here. He won player of the week for us like 4 times. I mean, he's far and away the best quarterback in the league. I don't think it's remotely close. Teamu could have an argument for some weeks, but just body of work, A.J. McCarron, easily the best quarterback in the league.
Yeah, I mean, I'd totally agree with that. I think McCarron was just lights out. I mean, just from watching the games, I thought he maybe played one bad game all year. I mean, he was just remarkably consistent. And I think that's something, you saw across the league was a lot of inconsistency with quarterback play. Even the guys who we would consider some of the better XFL quarterbacks like Teamu or DiNucci, just vastly more inconsistent than a guy like McCarron. And I mean, how awesome is it that he's, turning down practice squad deals and stuff like that so that he can sling the rock in the XFL, right?
Definitely. That's the kind of wholesome stuff that you like to see. That's what football's all about.
Yeah, and it makes him like an incredible ambassador for the league. Like he's going to be the face of the league for years to come, assuming he, doesn't get the big bucks again to play in the NFL.
Yeah, I don't see him chasing a big contract. So like you said, I think he'll be around for a few years, no doubt. He can really lead a franchise into a new fruition, and that's what's nice about him. The guy is a quarterback in real life and in his professional life. So appreciate you, McCarron.
So it was actually more than 420 yards, correct?
429 is what I have.
It's like, damn, if it would have been 420, it's like I did in the chat. It's like 420, blaze it. It's the fact that, he passed for that many yards and then blew in already an existing record that DiNucci, was it DiNucci or Dormany that had 5?
It was Dormany.
Dormany for McCarron to make a league record in the final game of the season, despite not making the playoffs, I think that says something. And I agree with you guys. I mean, there's just no way that anybody else could even get the MVP honors for the year. I mean, it has to go to McCarron because obviously he didn't throw as many interceptions as DiNucci. So.
Yeah, that's a much different competition.
Okay, let's move on to the defensive player of the week. We got Devontae Beckett with the Houston Roughnecks. He's a linebacker. If you don't know him, I'm sure you know him after the last game he was in. The man had 6 tackles on the week, 2 tackles for a loss, 1 interception, and 1 touchdown. He looked good, and he just provides another piece in this Houston defense that we keep seeing show out week on week.
Devontae Beckett for the last 3 weeks has been an absolute spark plug on defense. I mean, he's been covering people, and I know I said that was a weak spot for the defense was linebackers and coverage, but man, Devontae Beckett's been on an absolute tear. He's got a couple of touchdowns, several forced turnovers. The guy he seems unstoppable. He's everywhere that the ball is, and I don't know if that's by design or what, but the man is he's playing like his hair is on fire, and it's a lot of fun to watch. I think he is probably one of the defensive player of the year candidates. I don't know I don't know that he would necessarily win. There's several defensive backs that are probably in that conversation. Especially I think it's Michael Joseph out of DC has had a huge season. But in terms of linebackers, I think Tavante Beckett's season has been definitely up there in statistics.
Yeah, I've got 34 solo tackles, 29 assisted. So it's pretty good. He matches with Ellerby, though, on this Houston defense. They have the same amount of solo tackles, interesting enough.
Yeah, Beckett's just been awesome. He's one of the guys who really pops when you watch the Houston defense. And that defensive touchdown he scored last week actually ended up winning me a decent bit of money. So that was a great gift right there.
Can we ask, how much did you win? Just curious.
So it was only for the single game contest for the Houston Arlington game, and with the non-primetime games, the prize pools are typically pretty small. So it was only I think a $3,000 prize pool with $1K to first. But I did end up beating out a bunch of Luis Perez teams because I played a ton of Houston defense in my captain spot there because I figured Arlington would play all their backups. That ended up being wrong, but I still ended up winning because the Houston defense just shut them down so hard. So and that team had Jeremy Cox too, which was he was the highest scoring fantasy player in that contest. Which,
Good
so that was an exciting defensive touchdown for me for sure.
Jake Leonard, what you got?
Not much. I think his performance speaks for itself.
Yeah, that's not his boy. He's not going to tell us he had 3 more tackles than he actually had.
Blazing. Well, fellas, that about wraps up the show. I appreciate everybody today coming on, speaking, spending your time with us tonight. I want to say thanks to our special guest, Jake Tribbey, as well as the co-host, Drew Wells and Jake Leonard. Been a great year so far. Thank you guys all for coming in. I look forward to more XFL football.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to say thanks to you, Jake, too. Normally I'm carrying the burden for the betting and stuff like that. It's good to have an actual expert in-house to distract from my vast failures this year.
Yeah, really, really appreciate you guys having me on. I mean, it's been a really fun show, and I love talking XFL. I mean, this stuff is a ton of fun. It's an honor to be able to, write articles and talk about it. And yeah, really appreciate you guys having me on. I thought this was great.
Well, guys, before we hop off, shout out your socials, please. Tell us where to find you. Then I'm going to say some thank yous and salutations, and we'll hit the road.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Jake Tribbey. I mean, that's where I post pretty much everything nowadays, and all my articles are available at fantasypoints.com, and pretty much all the NFL offseason stuff I do, plus the XFL stuff and USFL. It's all free. So, yeah, check out fantasypoints.com if you want to read some great free fantasy football content.
There you go. Free is my favorite price. So, Drew Wells, your loyal and enduring co-host. So, Twitter is my primary means of communication when it comes to the XFL. You'll find me at Ambush Sports HOU for Houston. At Ambush Sports HOU.
All right, you can find me on Facebook, Jake Leonard, Twitter at Jake Leonard JRN. See, I almost did a Drew. It's like, no, that ain't right.
Yep.
So outside of here, I'm probably be kind of doing a little bit of a transition from XFL to MLS. Since I'm the departmental editor over that for Ambush Sports. So obviously later tonight I've got to get results in from St. Louis City's Lamar Cup, Open Cup against Omaha, get that ready to go, and then start, because I'm way behind on the MLS stuff. So I'll be switching over that way. Reporting on any off-season transactions that may happen, new contracts for the XFL when they become available. But as for now, going to start transition to MLS, and maybe I might write of any news that may come out of Premier League. And obviously, shout out to Wrexham for getting promoted to the FL. They're no longer languishing in the National League. So I'll probably be writing a little bit about that as well. Outside of Ambush, I run my own news outlet called Heartland Newsfeed. You can find out more about that at heartlandnewsfeed.com.
Yeah, it's not usually a great place to plug soccer or world football when you're talking about football heads here in the States, but it's an exciting time to get into soccer if you're not already. There's a lot going on both internationally and domestically here in the States. So I can kind of back Jake on that. I personally follow Nashville SC. Those guys have a solid team, but there's a lot of solid teams in the MLS, and there's a lot of MLS teams, so it's easy to link up with a squad. So do your research, read about them, and tune into some good TV.
And let's be fortunate that neither one of our teams are in the current condition of Kansas City right now.
Cellar dweller.
I am Matthew Tyler. This is the XFL Insider Podcast. You can find me on any social network, streaming platform, whatever. This is our wonderful show. We do it for the love, and we appreciate everyone that listens and just keeps up with what's going on in the XFL. I want to thank ambushsports.net. They've helped us out a lot. That has given us the ability as media to provide coverage at games, in games, and receive information when it first comes out. So thank you, Ambush Sports. Also want to thank XFLboard.com. They put us on their website, show us off, as well as that they generate a lot of discussion over there. And so it's a good place to be. It's a good place to check out. Just give them a check out and tell us what you think. As always, we appreciate you listening. We appreciate all our guests coming on. And we really look forward to this divisional matchup week. Going into it, Drew and I will be there as media coverage. We look forward to it, as well as the championship game, regardless of the Houston outcome. So we look forward to being there and providing coverage for everyone at home. What you got, Drew?
A whole lot to look forward to with a Houston win. Not a lot with a Houston loss.
Amen. At least we'll get to check out the Alamo. Do some sightseeing,
Have something to remember.
Yes, sir. But otherwise, it's been great. I thank you all for coming. Thank you, fans, for listening. We look forward to our next episode after the divisional championship game. And for me, that's it. So long.
Enjoy, people.